He tells him what? It's hard to hear you. He tells him what? His vision of revolutions in Eastern Europe, supported by the U.S., and even armed by the U.S. Wait, this is the guy who supports using atomic weapons, right? So is everybody scared then? They are. Yeah. Yeah, okay, well, that's about right. Yeah. Jesus. Yeah. August 25th, 1952. This week come top-level talks in Moscow between the Soviets and the Chinese. Oh, to be a fly on the wall and know what they're discussing. Oh, wait. We do. Check it out. I'm Indy Neidell, and this is the Korean War. Last week was actually a week full of fighting in the field, for once, as the Battle of Bunker Hill raged all week long. The battle continues this week, though not nearly as heavy and bloody as last week's many Chinese assaults were. Only one of a half dozen Chinese attacks this week at all threatens to overrun the position. That happens this evening, but it's not a threat for all that long, and the week ends and Bunker Hill is still in UN hands. The fighting over in 5th Marine Regiment sector is pretty much thoroughly stopped by the heavy rains this week that turn it into a swamp, and a bridge over the Imjin River is even washed away when 230 millimeters, 9 inches, of rain fall the last 2 days of the week, and that is a lot. That's fighting against Chinese opposition. And while there isn't much fighting against Korean opposition this week, there is stuff dealing with Korean POWs. We saw 2 weeks ago that UN Commander Mark Clark wants to release the POWs the UN holds that claim to be South Korean if they can prove they lived below the 38th parallel before the war began and they swear allegiance to South Korea. Today, the 25th, he begins the difficult job of convincing Washington to let him do this. This is even more difficult than it might otherwise be, because when his request arrives, the U.S. State and Defense Departments are both busy wondering what the significance of the ongoing talks between China, Communist China, and the USSR in Moscow is, and they're preparing a presidential statement. Especially State is really reluctant to agree to something like Clark's plan, which might affect the reception of such a statement. What are these Chinese-Soviet talks, anyhow? Well, thanks to this channel's spy network within the USSR, we've obtained a record of a conversation between Soviet leader Josef Stalin and Chinese Foreign Minister Zhou Enlai from August 20th in Moscow. Those also present for the Soviet side are comrades Molotov, Fedorenko, and Vyshinsky, and for the Chinese side, comrades Chen Yun, Li Fuchun, Zhang Wenqian, and Su Yu. The conversation begins with Zhou conveying greetings from Communist Chinese leader Mao Zedong and asking about Stalin's health, and the reverse. And everyone is indeed healthy. Zhou mentions that everyone in China is looking forward to the 19th Congress of the Communist Party in the Soviet Union. Stalin says that though the Congress has not been convened for years, that in 1939, there were 1,500,000 party members, and now there are around 6 million, despite the fact that they have restraints about letting in new members. Here is a long quote from the minutes of the meeting. Zhou Enlai asks for permission to speak about the aims of the coming of the Chinese delegation. He reminds him about the telegram from Mao Zedong in which the wishes of the Chinese government are stated. He points out 3 groups of problems. The first problem is the situation in Korea. The second concerns the internal situation of the People's Republic of China for the last 3 years and the 5-year plan of economic development. He underlines that the written report has been under preparation. The Chinese delegation would like to come to this question after the report will have been submitted. The third concerns the extension of the agreement on Port Arthur. Stalin notes the initiative on the extension of the time of the joint use of the naval base of Port Arthur must come from the Chinese side. We are guests there, and guests do not put such questions. Zhou Enlai agrees with Comrade Stalin and suggests that they should exchange notes. The Chinese government will address the Soviet government with the appropriate request. Okay, then there's some small talk about a Mongolian-Chinese railway and some geological exploration and some back and forth about sending some industrial specialists to China to train the locals in various heavy industries. Then they get down to military stuff and the Chinese 5-year defense plan. Zhou says the Chinese want military equipment, and Stalin wonders whether he means actual weapons or materials for making armament factories. Zhou says right now he's talking about weapons, but he also asks for assistance in the form of jet planes, pointing out that in the first 5-year plan, making plane factories would not be possible, and developing jets and jet facilities would take like 5 years on their own anyhow. Stalin says that the Soviet Union can send motors and other spare parts of aircraft to China, and China can organize the assembling of these airplanes. Personnel are trained in this way. Assembly plants can be converted into aircraft building plants. First, you have to build a plant or two to assemble engines. We will send out the motors and other parts for the aircraft, which can be assembled in China. Having organized assembly plants, it will be possible to construct factories to build planes in 3 years. This is the easiest and right path. Zhou says, yeah, that makes sense. Stalin then asks, what happened to the weapons they recently sent? Zhou says, out of 10 divisions for which they got the weapons, 3 were given to North Korean ones, and 4 Chinese units in Korea. Stalin says, so they're all going to Korea. Yep, says Zhou. Well, he doesn't say yep, but he agrees. And they're trained for 3 to 4 months with them to gradually master them. Stalin says, in such cases, we act in a way that people could get well acquainted with the armaments and organization of divisions. It takes time, about 6 months. Without it, you can lose weapons. In addition, during this time, we check how all the appliances work, and only then send these units to the front. Of course, you can perform this training in the rear, not close to the front, like in Korea, for example. Half of the divisions receiving new weapons should be left in China. Zhou Enlai remarks that sending divisions to Korea is caused by losses that require replenishment. Stalin underlines that it is necessary to give the trained divisions to Korea, then it will be stronger. They then turn to artillery, and I will quote you from the meeting transcript yet again. Stalin asks if they can produce the shells in China. Zhou Enlai answers that they have started doing that. He underlines that to 1 Chinese shell, they get 9 American shells in response. Stalin says that is bad. He adds that if the Americans shoot 9 shells, the Chinese are expected to shoot 20. We have strangled the Germans by shells. We had 1 gun at a distance of 2 meters, and the Germans had 1 gun at a distance of 1 kilometer. Artillery is an important thing. The Chinese government should launch the production of shells. We will help to build such plants. Zhou Enlai says that they want to reorganize the existing plants and design new plants. Stalin says they need the machine tools for the 122mm shells, for the 3-inch and anti-aircraft guns. We can help in this case. Large plants are not needed to be built. We are building shells at different factories. It is difficult to manufacture everything in one factory. Zhou then goes over the situation in Korea, explaining that before May 1951, the Korean War was not positional but was maneuverable. Since May 1951, the front is set, and the war became positional. The forces on the two sides are roughly equal. The enemy cannot really conduct offensive operations, so a certain balance is maintained. The UN has strengthened its position on a depth of 15 to 20 kilometers and continued to expand the underground work. The enemy cannot disrupt their fortified positions. The front line is about 200 kilometers long and is strong the whole way. Mao Zedong put forward 3 questions in writing. Can they push back the enemy? Well, they've seen that they can. Can they hold their own positions? Yep, that they can do. Can they conduct offensive operations? Stalin asks what the genuine answer to that last question is. Zhou says, well, they can take outposts, but a general offensive, not really, not with the positional nature of the war. He also adds, the Americans are just delaying things and don't actually want a truce. As we have seen, this is exactly what the UN thinks the communists are doing. Well, they then get into the POW numbers, which I've been over a lot, and will likely cover more in future. Zhou Enlai informs that Mao Zedong, analyzing the current situation in this question, believes that it is necessary to stand firm on the return of all prisoners of war. The Koreans think that the continuation of the war is unprofitable because the daily loss is greater than the number of prisoners, the return of which is at issue. But the end of the war is unprofitable to the U.S. Mao Zedong considers that the continuation of the war is beneficial to China, as it prevents the U.S. from making preparations for a new world war. Stalin. Mao Zedong is right. The war spoils the American blood. The North Koreans lost nothing except the victims that they had suffered in the war. The Americans understand that this war is not profitable to them, and they will have to finish it, especially after it becomes clear that our troops remain in China. You need to endure, be patient. Of course, it is necessary to understand the Koreans. They have a lot of victims, but they need to be explained that it is a big deal. You need to have patience, need more self-possessions. The Korean War showed the weakness of the Americans. The troops from 24 countries cannot long support the war in Korea, as they have not achieved their goals and cannot expect to succeed in this business. Both men agreed that they should be prepared for at least another year of the war. Then Stalin goes off on the USA. The Americans are not capable in general to carry on a great war, especially after the Korean War. Their whole force is in the raids, in the atomic bomb. England will not fight for America. America cannot beat Little Korea. The Germans conquered France in 20 days. The US cannot cope with Little Korea for 2 years. Are they a power? They want to conquer the world and cannot cope with Little Korea? No, the Americans do not know how to fight. Especially after the Korean War, they lost the ability to conduct large war. They hope for a nuclear bomb, air raids, but they will not help win the war. Infantry is needed, but they have weak and few infantry. They fight against Little Korea, and people in the U.S. are weeping already. What will happen if they start a great warfare? Then perhaps all will weep. Zhou asks, and this is very interesting, if the Chinese should now start bombing South Korea. Stalin says, aviation is a state industry, and the Chinese army is officially volunteers, so they should not be using state airplanes. They talk a little bit more about the general mood and morale, but that is the real gist of the whole conversation. It is pretty eye-opening in a bunch of ways, and you can feel free to tell me your thoughts in the comments. There is actually someone in the U.S. finally talking about the Korean War this week. On the 21st, Republican presidential candidate Dwight Eisenhower speaks about the war, which he has not much done so far in this campaign, when he's pushed in an interview to explain how his policies concerning the war would differ from those of current President Harry Truman and current Secretary of State Dean Acheson. Instead, he attacks former UN Commander Douglas MacArthur's and Senator Robert Taft's aggressive approach to it, saying it would involve the U.S. in a war with China, an open war with China, which would be harder to stop than the one they're currently fighting. This might be very unsatisfying to much of the country that wants him to talk about the war itself and what his concrete plans are. He's going to have to tell them at some point. Thing is, it was widely assumed that Ike's nomination meant that foreign policy would not become a political football. Both candidates shared a consensus on containment. Indeed, during the Truman period, Eisenhower was closer to decision-making than Stevenson. He was prepared, however, to fight a partisan campaign, both to appease the right following Taft's defeat and to tap the deep public frustration with containment, a policy which was symbolized by the Korean War. The party's platform really does condemn containment as not just negative, but also immoral. They instead want Ike, that's Eisenhower, to talk up the concept of liberation. This was originally a Taft idea and has been talked up a lot by Ike's foreign policy guy, John Foster Dulles, whom I said a few weeks ago is a fan of the concept 2 weeks ago, is a fan of the concept of massive retaliation, which involves using even atomic weapons as a deterrent, instead of what he sees as the treadmill concept of containment that leads nowhere. He pairs this with liberation, a crusade to try to stimulate freedom in the Soviet satellite states. He figures these two policies would not just contain, but roll back the power of the USSR, and it would eventually fall apart. Eisenhower has real doubts about massive retaliation, but he does endorse liberation. In choosing to preach liberation, Eisenhower avoided commitment to specific measures. The concept was kept carefully ambiguous, although Ike emphasized that the policy would be pursued by peaceful means. Liberation, however, threatened to boomerang in late August. Yep, see, Dulles gives a speech in Buffalo, a fiery one, and then, after that, at a press conference, tells his vision of revolutions in Eastern Europe, supported by the U.S. and even armed by the U.S. This goes viral, and suddenly there are fears of an atomic war abounding all over the U.S., on which Ike's opponent, Adlai Stevenson, is quick to capitalize. This might even sabotage Eisenhower's support among independents, and he is furious with Dulles. He speaks out about the peaceful nature of liberation, and then decides he's going to drop it for the rest of the campaign. Oh, and speaking of presidential campaigns, I mentioned 2 weeks ago the South Korean President Syngman Rhee won his re-election campaign. This week on the 24th, it officially begins. And as that begins, this week of the war ends, with a little fighting and a lot of rain in Korea, and a meeting in Moscow. And it would be very interesting if the UN nations fighting the Korean War actually had the minutes of that meeting, especially the US, I guess, to know that Stalin and Zhou believe the US does not, in fact, want a truce and is delaying things intentionally. But there's also this that they also believe, which I will repeat to end things today. The end of the war is unprofitable to the US. Mao Zedong considers that the continuation of the war is beneficial to China, as it prevents the US from making preparations for a new world war. Stalin says Mao Zedong is right. The Americans understand that this war is not profitable to them, and they will have to finish it, especially after it becomes clear that our troops remain in China. I suddenly have a feeling that I have plenty of this war left to cover, which I can do thanks to the extraordinary efforts of the Time Ghost Army, for that is who allows me to do all that we do. Gary Lee Worthington is the Army Member of the Week here. You could join the Time Ghost Army at timeghost.tv or patreon.com. Do not forget to subscribe. I will see you next time. We are building shells at different factories. It is difficult to manufacture everything in one factory. That's my Stalin. It's not very good. You can cut that out.